Hi guys, happy Monday. Welcome back. I hope you all had a enjoyable weekend. I hope you did, something fun that brought you some kind of joy in these tough-ish times. So today we're going to be covering the Cold War, the globalization of that conflict, and decolonization during the Cold War era. So it's a lot of topics to cover. I'm definitely going to have to break this into multiple videos. I actually tried recording this lecture on Friday, and it was way, way, way too long as one video. So we're going to be breaking it up mostly so I can get a break, but also so that it just isn't an overwhelming length. And just like last time, there will be a lecture quiz that I'll post on Google Classroom for you to take after. Thank you also to those of you who, let me know how you were doing in last week's lecture quiz. For the most part, it sounded like people were doing okay, although, somewhat bored. So for those of you who are bored, try and find something fun to do to keep your mind occupied so you don't go totally crazy during this. And also thank you to those of you who asked me how I was doing. That was really nice of you. I am doing actually pretty well. I'm feeling in good health, which is, the most important thing right now. And, trying to do fun stuff. My fun activity on Saturday was deep cleaning my apartment, which, not that thrilling, but feels productive. And yesterday, the weather was pretty nice and went on a 9-mile walk. Still keeping my spirits up. So thank you to those of you who asked. So to start for today, I wanted to touch on a few questions that people had asked from last week's lecture, and also thank you to those of you who asked questions. So the first question we got was from Harini. So she was asking about de-Stalinization. What was Khrushchev's motivation to start de-Stalinization? What did he think he was going to achieve by criticizing him? I thought this was a really good question because we can tap into understanding the purpose here of that. So in 1953, when Stalin dies, we know that Khrushchev is the one who eventually takes over. And he, in 1956, gives that secret speech in which he criticizes Stalin. And this was part of a larger movement or policy to de-Stalinize Russia. And we saw in the lecture photos of the big statues of Stalin being brought down and things like that. So on last week's lecture, there is a hyperlink to a copy of English version of Khrushchev's secret speech. So that's a good place to start to kind of hear more from him about why he believes Stalinization is not ideal. But there are several sort of theories around his genuine purpose. Why would he decide to start criticizing Stalin? And so there are a couple of resources here for you to check out that I think are really interesting and useful. But to summarize, one of the theories is that Khrushchev genuinely, deep in his heart, did not agree with the way Stalin was running the Soviet Union. He genuinely did not agree with the really repressive and oppressive measures that Stalin's regime was taking, especially the torture and execution and imprisonment of thousands of political prisoners or political what's the word I'm looking for? Political objectors. So that's one theory, that maybe he deep in his heart really didn't think it was the right choice. And maybe that's true. Other theories include that maybe he was trying to make the Soviet Union seem like a more legitimate, forward-moving country. When you have a regime that is constantly imprisoning people and torturing them and executing them, it doesn't look so good for you. It doesn't give you the best reputation. So there is some thought that maybe Khrushchev was trying to make the Soviet Union more of an admirable kind of country, and in the context of the Cold War, that would make sense, right? Competing with the United States, we are a country that has tons of freedoms and civil liberties and stuff like that, and maybe he was trying to prove that the Soviet Union was sort of just as good as that. Another theory is that Khrushchev did not immediately emerge in 1953 as the obvious successor to Joseph Stalin. There were a number of people who were kind of vying for power after Stalin died. And one idea behind his de-Stalinization policy and behind his, secret speech in 1956 is that he was trying to discredit some of his opponents. Some of the people that he was basically competing for power with included people who had been sort of in Stalin's inner circle. And so some historians think that maybe by discrediting them, he was sort of proving by discrediting Stalin's ideas, he was also in a sense discrediting them and making himself seem like a successor for Joseph Stalin. So those are a lot of interesting theories. My personal opinion is it's probably not one or the other. It's probably some kind of combination of all of those and or more. But thanks, Tarini, for that question. I think, again, that brings us to a moment to think about purpose. Why would he be doing this? What's the desired outcome from Khrushchev's point of view? So bringing in those good contextualization skills. Next, we got a question from Karthik. I talked in last week's lecture about the disparities between the economic disparities between East Germany and West Germany today. I mean, obviously today Germany is one country, but the part of Germany that used to be Western Germany is far ahead of the part of the country that used to be Eastern Germany in terms of employment, in terms of technology, in terms of general life, what's the word I'm thinking of? Basically life standards. And so he was asking why that is. Germany was reunified in the early 90s, and so he was asking why hasn't Eastern Germany caught up. Again, I've pulled a couple of resources that are really interesting, I think, that answer this question in one way or another. So when the two Germanys were reunited in 1991, by that point there was no more Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan aid was really only given in the years immediately following World War II to help countries rebuild. So that program had ended by the 60s. And when the two halves reunify, there were some programs put in place to kind of even the playing field, so to speak. But clearly not all of those programs have worked. I mean, you have to think about Germany kind of like we think about the United States. There are parts of our country that are still very impoverished, where the standard of living is pretty low, where there aren't tons of jobs. And the same applies to the situation in Germany. In Eastern Germany, a lot of their industrial technology wasn't as advanced, so they weren't producing as many sort of high quality goods as were being produced in Western Germany. There weren't the buildings that were built in East Germany weren't as nice as the buildings in West Germany. So even today, property values in Western Germany are a lot higher than property values in Eastern Germany, and that's largely due to the fact that more people want to live in the parts of Western Germany today because it's a nicer place to live. And so those things continue to contribute to inequalities between the two halves of Germany. Some suggestions that have been posed to even the playing field are imposing job quotas in the eastern part of Germany today. So putting in laws in local areas that would say, you have to have X amount of people employed, and forcing, the cities and the counties to create employment opportunities, because the more people that are employed, obviously, the higher your standard of living goes. So there have been a number of solutions that have been posed, even, as late as 2018, 2019. But there still is definitely that inequality that exists. So thanks, Karthik, for that great question. And for those of you interested, please check out some of these articles. They're really interesting, help you understand the differences that exist between the two parts of Germany today, and help you understand some of the solutions that are being attempted even in the modern years. So there's also a question from Asia about decolonization. We're going to get to decolonization later today, so I'm going to hold that question for now. But let's get going here. Today, this is the lecture overview. Like I said, I'm going to have to split this into multiple videos just because there's so much interesting content to cover. This is an area of content that I really like and I feel excited about. So that means I'm likely to kind of go off onto tangents and stuff like that. So I will try to keep it concise. But yeah, I'm definitely going to have to split this into a couple of videos. So we're going to start by talking about the globalization of the conflict, how the conflicts of the Cold War spread around the world outside of just Europe. So we'll talk about Asia. We'll talk specifically about China and Korea, and then we'll talk about Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then we're going to switch over to the decolonization that starts to happen in the post-war world and seeing the ways that the Cold War impacts that decolonization. So we'll talk a little bit about Southeast Asia, particularly the First Indochina War, which is essentially Vietnam's independence war from the French. We'll talk a little bit about Africa, mostly focusing on Algeria and South Africa. Algeria, which also got independence from the French, and South Africa, which had a much more complicated situation due to its history. We'll talk super briefly about the Middle East, the new state of Israel that's created after World War II ends, and its conflict with its new neighbor Palestine. And then super briefly about India. So we're not going to touch on every single place that is decolonized after World War II, but just a couple of the ones that have been significant because there's been a lot of like controversy even into modern day about them. If you haven't already copied this lecture overview down in your notebook, now might be a good time to pause the video and to copy these things down so that you have a structure for your notes, because then you can add in notes about what I'm saying into your outline. So let's get going now. So part one is the globalization of the conflict. Like I mentioned, obviously the Cold War is not just limited to Europe. So we'll talk about the ways in which this power struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies plays out in other parts of the world. I'm going to start by talking about China. So before World War II actually had even started, there had been the beginnings of a Chinese civil war. There was a growing communist revolution in China under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and him and his communist followers had essentially been fighting against the Chinese nationalist government. When World War II began, they had to put that on pause for a little while because they had to fight the Japanese, who had invaded China, as we know. When World War II ends, the Civil War resumes. And so the Chinese communists under the leadership of Mao Zedong are fighting against the Chinese nationalists under the leadership of this guy named Chiang Kai-shek. So the two are fighting each other, but the communists are doing really, really well. And basically by 1949, the communists win the Chinese Civil War, and they establish what's called the People's Republic of China. So that is the official name for, what we would just call China. It's for the Chinese Communist government that is now controlling all of mainland China. So under the Mao's People's Republic, a lot of changes take place, similar to what we saw take place in the Soviet Union, for instance. So they also go through the process of collectivization of agriculture. They also go through their own sort of 5-year plans with, unfortunately, a lot of the same outcomes, some of the same issues like food shortages and famines and things like that. China also undergoes a cultural revolution. This that I'm circling here is what's called Mao's Little Red Book. Essentially, it was this like little Bible of sorts for how to be like a good Chinese communist. And it was filled with all sorts of, pro-communist propaganda, things like, songs and, why you should be enamored with Mao and stuff like that. One of my students last year, actually, his parents used to have a copy. They had grown up in communist China and they had a copy of the Little Red Book, and he wanted to bring it in, but he told me that his parents had burned it because they were just like, that was, not a great time in our history, and they had actually burned the book to get rid of it. So yeah, pretty intense. So anyways, the People's Republic is established, and that's a big deal internationally because, of course, it's like a big shift in the international balance of politics. When the Cold War first begins in 1945, you have the Soviet Union and the United States, two big superpowers, and then their allies. Well, now you have another kind of emerging superpower, and that's China. And so it throws off kind of the balance. It also meant that there was a large communist presence in Asia, which is now a new threat for the United States to have to deal with. So China and the Soviet Union, at least at first, attempted to show like a big unified front. This is Mao and Stalin. I think this is taken at like Stalin's birthday party or something weird like that. And they tried to be this very unified front. although they were not as unified as they might have appeared. The Chinese communists under Mao kind of resented the Soviet Union. They felt like they were always treated like little brother. They had some of their own interpretations of how communism should work that did not necessarily align with the Soviet Union's interpretation. Eventually, in the 1950s, we're going to see something called the Sino-Soviet split, where basically the Chinese communists and the Soviet Union split. They don't necessarily align with each other, and they don't interact much with each other after about 1956 or so. They kind of go their own way. But anyways, so China, the People's Republic of China, is established in 1949, and that brings us to a big issue, which is what happens with the United Nations. Because you might remember from last week's lecture that in the United Nations, there's the Security Council, and that is the part of the UN that actually makes all the big decisions. And there are 5 countries that have permanent seats at the Security Council, which means that they also have veto power, so they can shut down anything that they don't like with just their own one vote. And those 5 permanent members are the Soviet Union, France, the United States, Great Britain, and China. And so now this becomes an issue, and here's why. The People's Republic of China, the communists basically controlled all of mainland China. And so they said that they were the legitimate government of the people who lived in this area. Now, the nationalists, the people under Chiang Kai-shek, the people who had ruled China before all of this, and the people that the United States supported, they weren't completely gone. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, when they'd been fighting against the communists in mainland China, they'd had to retreat, and they'd retreated all the way to Taiwan. And they were still there. They were had established themselves there, and they said, you know what? No, the communists are not a legitimate government. They are just a bunch of rebels that took over, that tried to institute a coup. We, the Republic of China, it's called the ROC. Oh my gosh, it's called the ROC. We are the legitimate government of all of these people. Even though we're over here right now, we're the legitimate government. And so the issue is that there are essentially 2 different governments, each claiming to be the legitimate government of the Chinese people. And this is very complicated for a lot of people. The United States, when faced with this 2 China sort of conflict, the U.S. and their allies decide to pursue what they call the One China system. Essentially, they are not going to recognize both governments as legitimate governments. They are only going to recognize, surprise, surprise, the Republic of China, which is out in Taiwan, as the legitimate government of the Chinese people. Because obviously the United States and their allies, they don't want to recognize or deal with more communists. So they say that the Republic of China is the only legitimate Chinese government. And therefore, a representative from the Republic of China gets to sit at China's seat at the United Nations. Someone from the PRC, the People's Republic of China, does not get to sit at the China seat. And this is really infuriating for the Soviet Union, because from their point of view, the People's Republic of China, the Chinese communists, they now control mainland China. They are the legitimate government of China, and they deserve to sit at the China seat. But the United States, Britain, and France all decide together it's not going to work that way. The Republic of China, they were the government in charge before, and they are still the legitimate government, and they get to sit in the China seat. And so logically, this might not make a lot of sense. I mean, I feel like when you just look at the situation, it probably makes the most sense to have the government that controls all these people. They should be the ones sitting in the seat. But, in the context of the Cold War, that's not what we want. And so, as a result of all this, the Soviet Union is actually so upset by this decision that they start boycotting the UN. No one sits in the Soviet Union's seat. They stop showing up for the meetings. They're just like, well, you know what? Screw you guys. We don't like that the choice that you made about who gets to sit in the China seat, because it's not our friend, right? It's not our ally. And so they stop showing up to the United Nations meetings. And that will have a big repercussion in a little bit. So you will find out what that repercussion is on our next video when we talk about Korea and the Korean War. So I will catch you on video number 2.